This is Labyrinth, and I'm Brian Froud, and I was the conceptual designer for this movie. What we're seeing now is a digital owl. This is pioneering stuff. This is one of the first times that a fully realized digital creature had turned up on the screen. It's fairly crude by today's standards, but it was quite astonishing in its time. And this was done by, oh, there's my lettering, done by ILM. The owl, of course, is a creature of the night. And so it's bringing, to the beginning of this story, all the night brings, which is dreams and maybe nightmares. And it's a creature of transformation as well, full of the things that this movie has. I worked previously on a movie called The Dark Crystal, and that was 5 years of my life, and this one was only 3 years of my life, so it was a holiday really, I suppose. We had finished Dark Crystal and were exhausted and had said never again. But I was in a limousine with Jim Henson and my wife Wendy, and Jim said, let's do another one. And I said, well, okay, well, why not? And we came up with the idea, and I said, why don't we do goblins? And his eyes lit up, and he said, because he loved the idea of goblin-y creatures. And but he said, this time I want to put people in it, not just puppets. And immediately I had a vision of a baby surrounded by goblins. And I went back to England and painted the picture. And that was the beginning of this movie. So we begin the film not quite knowing where we are. As the film began, maybe not, maybe it has. But we're definitely in some fairy tale. This, of course, is Jennifer Connelly. This is maybe, what, a third or fourth movie? She, after this, went back to college, and after that, went back into acting, and is an astonishingly wonderful actress. The dog's quite important showing up here. The reason it's that breed of dog is that we needed to do a puppet duplicate, and all that hair was easier to do as a puppet. And this is a very interesting run, because she's running across the bridge in England, and it starts to rain. And the next shot, she's actually physically in America. This was filmed in America, so that was quite a run. We filmed the whole thing at EMI in England. One of the reasons we did it there is that we already had a relationship with them. We were doing Dark Crystal, and Jim Henson had his TV show was filmed in England. So he was comfortable there. He loved the technicians there and their skills. So it was all filmed in England. But in those days, it was really considered important to have American actors. Dark Crystal, we had to have American voices for the Gelflings. They didn't accept English voices. It's sort of hard to believe now, in the days of Harry Potter, where all things English and in the fantastical world is very acceptable. It wasn't then. But at the same time, we were trying to make a story that was not only timeless, but also was part of everybody's life, American or not. So here's the first glimpse we have of Toby, the baby. Now, I said I'd painted this picture of the baby as original concept work for this film. And time we had really got round to filming, we always knew that we needed a 1-year-old baby, and my son Toby was 1 year old, so he became the baby in this. Now this is a tracking shot that shows some of the influences of the movie, but more in particular the influences of Sarah's mind. I have to say I was a bit fed up with Jim at this point, because we got on really well, but when I saw the shot I discovered he hadn't put any of my books in. He forgot. So I mean, my work was quite important for this movie, but never mind. But in the background we see another big influence, which is Escher, which we'll see later on in the film. So we're in the bedroom of a teenage girl who's about to grow up. And this is really her story.
Someone take me away from this awful place!
Oh, as a parent, and especially as Toby's parent, I find this very difficult. My instinct and Wendy's instinct is to rush to him and soothe him, crying, but of course you can't do that. It's forever trapped in film. Now, the reason he cried is because every time we put him in the cot, which was generally where we filmed in the afternoon for him, he didn't want to go to bed. He thought we were trying to make him go to bed, and he wanted to get out and play. So that was why he wailed.
She called on the goblins for help.
Now, this is very much like my painting. This is what I struggled hard to do, of course, in bringing to the screen all these grotesque faces. That it's easy enough to do a little drawing, but to bring those to life is actually quite hard. And we had a great team of people working in England, of various sculptors and costume makers, and I supervised them, said every day to do that.
And she can no longer stand it.
Now, the reason that the baby's in this little stripy outfit is that throughout the movie there are connections to various things, and one of the strong connections is to Alice in Wonderland. And this really is, in a sense, is Alice's stripy stockings. I also knew that the baby was going to be surrounded by these dark creatures with muted tones, and I wanted the baby to really stand out from everything. Now, what she's about to do is very traditional in fairy tales. Goblins, what they do is to steal babies and take them off to Goblin Land. And but they often need to be invited in, and she's just about to do the terrible thing and say the right words.
I wish the goblins would come and take you away right now. That's not hard, is it?
Here it goes.
I wish...
Did you say it?
He's one of my favorite. I mean, think about the goblins. They try hard to be mean and bad, but they don't really succeed. They're all a bit stupid and incompetent. And the other reason for the stripy outfit is that from a distance I knew that we were going to have duplicate babies, puppet babies, and so it needed to be very distinctive. And when you see the Goblin King throw the baby up in the air, you'll see why. one of the reasons this film is timeless is that we deliberately tried to do that. We put Sarah into a costume that didn't place her precisely in this world, that it looked all right in another world, into a fairy tale world, but also could be fashionable. So it's the waistcoat and the large shirt, but we also deliberately made sure she was wearing jeans, something very contemporary. And I think it really holds up after all this time. So you don't, a bit like The Wizard of Oz, you don't really think, oh, well, this is an old film. Now, the things that fairies and goblins do is often leave behind a changeling, a duplicate baby that's often ugly or strange, and what we think we're going to see is something strange. But we subverted that by showing nothing. Now, here is the creature of the night. Now, is this a messenger, or is it the Goblin King in a disguise? I do like French windows. French windows in films or in plays are always evocative, and anybody that comes in through the French windows, I think, is quite a powerful figure. In certain films, of course, it would be a vampire, be Dracula. But in this case, it's David Bowie as the Goblin King. And of course, as the Goblin King, he is also part of her inner life. He has to reflect some of her adolescent thoughts. So he's, in a sense, although he's the adversary, he's also like the hero. So I wanted to make him like a romantic figure. So I've made him part Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights, or Rochester from Jane Eyre. He also is like a leather boy from something from the Wild Ones. He also has kabuki, Japanese kabuki influences. He also is a knight from Grimm's fairy tale. He also is maybe a ballet dancer. Yeah, but also, of course, really importantly, he's a pop star. And so David was perfect for the part because he's very charismatic and indeed enigmatic, I suppose. And I met him a few days before we were shooting in his dressing room, and we'd in the workshop made a little bone flute as a little gift for him. And I presented it to him, and he did an astonishing thing. He sort of jumped up onto his dressing room table and hunkered down and played this flute, and he was quite astonishing. I had to sort of back away because he became this character with all its ambivalence. And so he brings something really special to this part. And see, we see behind here a glimpse of the labyrinth. I suggested the labyrinth as an idea because the labyrinth is like as a symbol of so many things, and it can imply so many things. And it not only gives us a place to be with all its variety of places, it's also really, I suppose, symbolic of her mind. Not only does it look like a mind or a brain, there are all its twists and turns, but it's convolutions of what goes on in our thoughts.
Well, come on, feet.
So, like all good traditional fairy tales, she's got the clock, the time to beat, and off she goes into this world, which we have a glimpse of. There's a center, but we realise there is a journey to be made. And well, every time I see this, I don't know what to say. I mean, there's a little theme going on here. I think this turns up later on in the movie.
Excuse me, but
This was pioneering stuff, Hoggle in particular. But first of all, we had to have a little fairy joke. I specialise in painting fairies, and I believe in fairies and passionately, but sometimes you haven't got to take everything too seriously. My wife Wendy sculpted the little figures here, which she is a doll maker and makes these wonderful creatures, and especially fairies. So it was fun for her to make these little mechanical ones. But Hoggle, you see, is quite a complex mechanical figure. There was the first time we used radio control so much, all in one head. Because Dark Crystal was mostly all puppets. As Jim wanted more humans in it this time, we were mixing techniques up in a way to tell the story. So we have human beings, and we have pure puppets, and we've got people in costumes. And this is a small person in a mechanical head. It had its problems, of course. The major one is like how to see out of these things, because it isn't just like a mask. You can't see through those eyes. The eyes are moving. Originally, Shari, who was the small person inside, had a little monitor, but that had problems because one day she kept bumping into things because the image got reversed. So when she was thought she was going left, she was going right. So eventually, I mean, she just was just looking through the mouth. And I remember Brian Henson, who was helping puppeteer this and do the voice, said one of the reasons he always goes all the time is because they have to open the mouth to allow Shari to peer through it to see where she's going. Now here we are in the beginning of the labyrinth, and this is interesting because it's not stonework here, but it's bricks. And the bricks are sort of reminding us that maybe one of my favourite places is Venice. So it's like these Venetian alleyways, which I always find very mysterious and rather maze-like. So it's partly referring to Venice, which turns up later in the movie. And it's also a garden wall. Garden images is important in this movie. And one of the things I think I like about this film is that it's not meant to be real. It is dreamlike, and so we had a lot of fun making the sets and being in them. And there's a sense of unreality, and there's lots of visual tricks we have in it. And this is these long vistas that are fake in the back. One of the things that gives this film a lot of life was magic was the sparkles everywhere. I mean, we must have used tons. I think a lorry turned up every day and delivered a whole load of sparkles for this.
What do they mean, Labyrinth? There aren't any turns or
Because the other thing, the reason for the bricks and the little indentations is it sets up one of the visual tricks we're about to see in a little while.
doesn't.
And there are lots of real visual tricks in this. Again, this is not the digital age. This is prior to it. We were pioneering a lot of animatronics in this movie, but a lot of the visual stuff was done for real, which again gives it an immediacy that's often lacking in films that came later. Here we are with our first creatures. We wanted to put this little worm in there, and I knew it needed to be minute, so I designed it with bright colors so you could see it when it was small. So we had two versions of it, one which is the actual size, is this tiny worm, and then we did a larger scale puppet that was then dropped into it visually. But it's, you can see that the brightness really lets you know it's there. And this film I had a lot of fun on in terms of designing the creatures. That there's a very Englishness going on here. So I like to put the scarf on. One of my big influences was Dickens, Charles Dickens. I loved all these characters, and I think this is a little Dickensian character. We'd been working on this film a long time and developing things, and I did a lot of concept work of ideas for characters, and some of which got into the story and others didn't. And come near the end, we thought the script needed a bit of tweaking, and so Jim said, you know, let's ask Terry Jones from Monty Python just to have a look at it. And Terry came in and liked the story and loved the Muppets, of course, and loved what we were doing. And he looked at my sketchbooks and flicked through them, and he'd find all sorts of things in the corner that sparked off his imagination, and started to rewrite the whole script. So the whole load of new characters came in. And the little worm at the beginning was one of those. And it's so Python-esque. Now, here's my son Toby, surrounded by the goblins. He's crying. It was one of the reasons that they would start the music very loud, and that always upset him. But he loved the goblins because he was always coming into the studio and seeing, you know, what he was doing, and he had a great time with them. So he wasn't frightened by them at all. And he's gone on to study sculpture for film and television, is now making puppets. And even as we speak, tonight he will be puppeteering on stage at the Brit Awards. And so this didn't do any harm to him at all. I think it probably influenced him, and he's part of this world now. Now, the Goblin King, as when I said, was a romantic figure. I always saw him as Lord of the Manor, surrounded by his dogs, you know, as they would. But with being the Goblin King, of course, he's surrounded by his goblins. But they are unruly. Now, part of his costume, I designed this swagger stick, which is part of the Lord of the Manor accoutrement, but also a scepter. But as you can see, the other thing it really is a microphone. So it gave the Goblin King, in his pop star aspect, something to hold and act with. Now we're in the ages now of the world, and where there's more stones, and it's more geometric. These are little guys, which were again a little sketch in the corner, that when we needed a device to change things, to move everything around, so that she knows that she's in a world that's fighting against her, that is not allowing her to get to the center very easily. And this is very early on in the shooting, one of the first scenes with David and Toby, with him holding the baby. We had a wonderful wardrobe mistress who had worked on the Superman movies, and she said that you needed lots of duplicate costumes because if anything goes wrong, you can't slow things down because it costs, whatever, $6 a second to film this stuff, so you can't stop. You've got to keep going. So we made these little romper suits for Toby the baby. And we thought we could just buy them, but what we discovered that the stripes didn't match up. So we had to track down the material and make exact duplicates. And we made about, 20 of these things. And then we discovered that the usual diaper was too bulky. And so we did slim down diapers. We actually invented a new diaper. And so first day of filming, and David's holding Toby, and Toby pees. And the diaper was too inadequate for the task, and we had to stop shooting for a while once we did a change. So that was the beginning of all this. She's about to discover how difficult this is. And she finds this very frustrating. And this is one of my concept designs, because I'm always looking to find easy resolved thing. And I love puppets and puppetry. And I fell in love with the Muppets. And I'm a huge fan of their work. And one of the most simplest, basic things of a puppet is for it to peer over the top of something. So I thought, well, I could, invent that. So I did that, and I thought, well, what if, you got another head peering underneath as well? And I suddenly had a thought that, as this was like Alice in Wonderland, playing cards are very important in Alice in Wonderland. And because they are upside down. They have, as you turn them around, they're the same. And so these are like three-dimensional playing cards. If you look, the doors have these designs, which are the designs on old-fashioned playing cards. And everything about this is referring to that. The different colors, the party colors, the little symbols, which are the knights, the knaves in the playing card system. And so once I'd done the design, of course, the script got designed around it. And so what would you do if you've now got 4 heads with different personalities saying things? What would they say? And in all good fairy tales, there are riddles and things to be solved, and so these are perfect to do that. The other thing, of course, is that the reason they're close to the wall, that you need to be hiding your puppeteers. Now, this is a very Alice in Wonderland moment of falling down the hole, and this is one of those genius ideas by Jim, who had said, well, remember this thing where you get the hands and you create faces. So he and a bunch of puppeteers had a great time rediscovering all these different faces. And this really works, I think, because it's real. If you did this a digital way, I don't think you'd believe it. You just dismiss it and go, oh, well, that's just a face. But you go, oh, my goodness, that's a face. And it's made out of hands. And it's all dependent on the cleverness of the shapes they're creating and the overhead lighting.
Was that wrong? Too late now.
So here she is in the oubliette, as the scriptwriter called it. I think we all said, what's an oubliette? Which we soon discovered.
She's in the oubliette. Shut up! She should not have gotten as far as the oubliette. She should have given up by now.
She'll never give up.
Won't she? The dwarf's about to lead her back to the beginning. She'll soon give up when she realizes...
David's in another costume here. I designed lots of different costumes. There were some more elaborate ones at various times. We did some costume fittings, and then sometimes David didn't think it was appropriate, but he went with most things. You can see him wearing a symbol there. He has this goblin symbol around his neck. I once came on an airplane into America and got stopped at security because they found something strange in my bag and they thought I was a terrorist. But it turned out it was just the Bowie symbol, which they were all intrigued with and really liked it.
Know what an oubliette is?
Do you?
Yes, it's a place you put people to forget about them. Now, what you've got to do is get out of here.
We get little glimpses now of Hoggle's costume. I mean, I designed it in such a way that he's sort of he's part goblin, but he's also, maybe a dwarf from like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He's definitely storybook, but I tried to do something with his jacket that was unusual, and I put some designs and swirls, which have a slight reference to the Mystics in Dark Crystal. And whenever he turns round, you can see that there's a face hidden in there as well, which is something I like doing. I've always loved medieval manuscripts and Gothic architecture in which there are always faces peering out at you.
Tell you what, you give me the bracelet, and I'll show you the way out of the labyrinth.
You were gonna do that anyway.
Yes, well, that's what would make it a particularly nice gesture on your part.
This is Hoggle was very hard to puppeteer, and it's an extraordinary thing that they did to coordinate all their actions, because off screen there's a whole bunch of people with their radio control levers, and they all have to be pulling the lever at the right time to coordinate, to give expression to that face. I mean, when they started, it was tough, but they gradually discovered, almost by intuition, they almost knew what each other was doing, and he could just be expressive. This is just a wonderful thing. Something, again, is just done for real. I mean, this is actually happening, and it's still just an astonishing bit of movie magic.
Ah, this is it. Come on, then.
Now, we enjoyed making things in the scenery that had shapes and forms that implied faces, but also we did real faces. And this is, I think, like puppets on a big scale, big chunky puppets made of stone. And I just think they're lovely. The other thing about them, of course, it allowed Terry Jones to write some great dialogue. And this is so Python-esque about what they say.
Forget it.
Oh, please. I haven't said it for such a long time.
Oh, all right. But don't expect a big reaction.
No, of course not. For the path you will take will lead to certain destruction. Thank you very much.
The crystal ball was quite an important symbol. It turns up and is used a lot. It's the Goblin King's particular artifact. You can see him manipulating it. He uses it as part of the story. You'll find out later that it turns into various things. And it's sort of course, dreamlike, and implies so much. Now, this is my design for David as the leather boy and part knight. We struggled a bit for the leather jacket, and it went off in a strange direction at one stage and was sort of rather theatrical and shiny, and I pulled it back and made it very leathery, and we incorporated this piece of armor on the left-hand side of his shoulder in which this worm is crawling through, and this indicates that he is a knight, but also he's very Grimm's fairy tale. He's very medieval as well, and yet has a strange romanticism to him.
Oh, really? Then how about upping the stakes?
It's not fair.
You say that so often. I wonder what your basis for comparison is. So the labyrinth's a piece of cake, is it? Well, let's see how you deal with this little slice.
This is our Indiana Jones moment. We needed some really dramatic thing that could chase them. And this is, we're in sort of a part of the labyrinth. Look, it's very Victorian down here, which I like. It's like a Victorian sewer, maybe. And we needed to be sort of claustrophobic. And I knew there was no escape for them. I mean, this was another, like, a kind of dangerous thing. I mean, these are real metal things on it. There was nothing fake about this. This was, it was gonna get you. But of course, the reveal, which is always about the goblins. And I love machines, you know, like, I love funny machines. And so I enjoyed, like, inventing that. So what we think is a space-age mechanical device turns out to be a Victorian goblin machine.
Hoggle, how can I believe anything you say?
Well, let me put it this way. What choice have you got?
This was not easy to climb up a ladder with fake hands, but it was probably one of the most dangerous things in the movie, probably.
What position is that?
No position. That's my point. And you wouldn't be so brave if you'd ever smelt the ball of eternal stench. It's...
Is that all it does, is smell?
Oh, believe me, that's enough.
I suppose one of the interesting things about working on this movie is the freedom that Jim gave me. He'd certainly done that on Dark Crystal, and then when we started on this one, he just let me do drawings and paintings and design, and that suggested story. I've always been interested in image as storytelling, and this is full of images that do that. This is coming out, that urn there is an old magician's trick, and actually the urn is now in my garden. But we're seeing a landscape that refers to all sorts of things. I've mentioned Alice in Wonderland, but it's also very much like Toy Town. There are toys that are now statues. It's an English garden, which I always felt was quite magical and mysterious, and indeed often had mazes in which, when you entered into, you would feel something magical could happen round any corner. And of course, in this movie, there's always something magical around every corner. So this is one of these things I just sort of made up. I just drew him, and I thought, well, we need... In a lot of English gardens in the 18th century, the aristocracy would hire a man to be a hermit. So when you wandered around the garden, your guests were there with a glass of wine. They would come in little like a grotto, and there would be this man sitting there dressed as a hermit, as sort of entertainment. And so I had this in mind of creating this wise man. So I created a throne made of stone, but it's of books, so this implies wisdom. And I don't know what happened. I mean, I did this hat, and I think I was thinking of leaves of books, of pages, and they were part of what goes down the edge of his hat. So they become part paper. They also refer to the bark of birch trees as well. So he becomes really organic. And And I drew this hat, and I thought, well, how do I finish the top? And I just sort of did this bird's head. Of course, as soon as Terry Jones saw it, he said, oh, well, it's great. The hat talks. And that's how this began. And the dialogue between the two, again, very Python-esque, is very funny. And then, of course, the problem is, we're not quite sure who's the most important figure. Is it the hat, or is it the so-called wise man?
Gracias, señorita.
Oh, you didn't have to give him that. He didn't tell you nothing.
Well then. There go a couple of suckers. It's so stimulating being your head.
Why did you say that?
We have a mixture here of, real things and paintings. We'll see these guys later on. Is that I love puppets, and I try to find all sorts of ways of incorporating lots of tricks. And we'll talk about him later when he turns up.
Wait a minute!
Keep the stuff.
Are you my friend or not?
No, I'm not. Hoggle ain't no one's friend. He looks after himself.
It was interesting to see this set, which is the fake hedges that around the back lot. You'd come across some little miniature stuff that looked very similar to this, but had been used in the Kubrick film with the maze in it, The Shining. Now, there are goblins that are just pure puppets, and there are goblins that are people in costumes. And these are one of the costume guys. And Jim said they wanted some weapons that they were going to torment Ludo. This is Ludo. So I was always looking for ways of bringing life to things. And I said, well, why don't we just not have just weapons as such, but have other creatures on poles? So these were just manipulated. They're actually puppets on a stick, I suppose. But we had a lot of fun with multiple characters. It was great to put little groups together. So this group with the helmets, and that's why I put little numbers on. So we have a sense that they have a function together, and yet they have their own individual characters, but albeit just a number. This is a bit of silliness, which is pure Muppets. So this is one of the first times we see Ludo. Now, of course, the Muppets are really famous for their big monsters, which I've always loved, and so we wanted to put one in this movie. So he's a combination of various things. He's part Yeti, maybe, part Bigfoot, part troll, but he's very much in the Muppet tradition of big, lovable monsters. Of course, being in this particular world, the first time we see him is upside down, where often things are upside down, which indicates that we're in a different space and a different world. It was just wonderful to have a character walking around in real space, this big, fully functioning. We had, of course, radio control for the head, but I think it was Ron Muick was in the costume. Did a great job. But you'll notice that because we have a problem, he can operate the head with a hand up the top, and he's got the other hand free to do the left hand here, but the right hand is loose. And you don't notice it very much. And we do swap them over. We swap them over now and then, so you believe he can do everything. But Ron did just a great job with the personality. He always make me laugh.
Get through the labyrinth. Get through the labyrinth. One thing for sure, she'll never get through the labyrinth. Cool.
Hey.
Now often people say with puppets that you need big eyes, and I really like the fact that I designed little small eyes. I think they're so expressive, and that brow. Now these door knockers, came from Terry Jones, looking again at a little sketch in the corner of my sketchbook, and said they'd be great, especially if they talk. And it's just another stroke of brilliance, both by Jim and everybody here, is the fact that the ring in his mouth means he can't talk, or the ring in the ears means he can't hear. And then to run with the idea, which is to have, which happens throughout this movie, decisions need to be made at various points, and riddles need to be solved, and there are things to overcome. Always doorways, always another space to get into, where you have to think about, overcome the difficulties. Of course, this is all symbolic of the things that she's going through. I mean, she's in adolescence. She goes through this film. She does grow up and learns a lot.
I don't want that thing back in my mouth.
Come on, I want to knock.
Doesn't want his ring back in his mouth.
And I love the sculpting on this, and I love the fact that metal is made to come to life. There's a great paint job here.
Sorry.
That's all right, I'm used to it.
You notice that in his face he has lots of colours. One of the things about foam latex that these things are made of, that it's a dead substance. It's very matte, and although it's flexible, it doesn't really have life. And what we have to do is feed life into it, not only with mechanics, but I found that, but also with the way we paint it. So if you actually add quite a lot of colours in there, a mixture of various colours, it implies life to it. And here's my son Toby with Uncle Davy, as we now call him. This is one of my favourite moments. Now, we're in a setting here that, especially with the vegetation and the trees, that really tell us that we're in like a Grimm's fairy tale, that this is a story from a book, maybe. Although, albeit real, especially in the psychological terms that we're trying to express here. But I think those trees, the shapes, are very evocative. One of my favourite artists is Arthur Rackham, who was turn of the century illustrator, and he drew trees with faces in it. And I've always felt that there's life in nature. This is just a little throwaway trick, which we had fun doing, which is to line up the rocks that were just abstract. And but when you see them a certain view, they are a face.
Well, the little lady gave me the slip, but I just hears her now, so I was about to lead her back to the beginning, like you told me.
I see.
In my design of the Goblin King, that I did this sort of rather sketchy hairdo, and I wasn't quite sure what I meant by it, and we did struggle a little bit for Bowie's wig. We went through a stage where we were trying to make it look like a wolf. That's what Jim felt we should do, wolf, and we didn't quite succeed in it. And but it became very strange. It became, let's say, rather referring to like kabuki theatre, it also is again like a pop star, like from a rock band, and it's quite like wonderful. I think it picks the light up and it makes him, which I think is important for him, ambivalent. You're not sure whether he has all this power or he's just posing or not, but We're about to find out.
Don't think a young girl could ever like a repulsive little
So there he is with his scepter and riding crop, which is to like to keep the goblins under control.
friend.
Don't matter.
You'll give her that hoggle or I'll tip you straight into the bog of eternal.
There's in the background we've got some real birds, but there were some mechanical ones made as well because the birds sort of kept flying away, and we needed some continuity. So there's some radio-controlled birds in there as well. Ludo is again a very ambivalent figure. Is that he's trying his best to help, but he's torn. He can't help himself. Again, this came from Terry Jones, looking at a little doodle of mine and say these look like wild creatures. Look, they could be crazy, and I've got to write about those. And I suppose in a sense these are homage to traditional Muppets. And Jim said we can do them like Bunraku style, that is with people behind puppeteering, and do it against like blue screen. In the end they did it against blacks, and so people wore black costumes, and so they would blend in, and I had to like now design these in bright colours so they would stand out and be separate out, so we could drop them into a scene. So it's a challenge to do something this bright and strange. I made one of them strange and wacky, and Jim got them to do wacky things, and this is so Jim Henson, is to eyes coming out and swallowing them, and he loved this thing. So they're so in any other terms they're Muppet monsters, but I tried to add some realism to them. We had to sort of feel that they were real, and yet we're not really in a real place. We're in a dreamlike place. So hopefully we succeeded here. But I was always busy on the film. I was hardly on the set, because I was always on the next set getting that ready. I was in the workshop getting the next creatures ready. But I remember walking through the rehearsal places to the next place as I was supervising things, and seeing these guys rehearsing and working out all the moves, and it was so joyous. They were always laughing and having a great time. Of course, the challenge here is to have a whole group of them, which are obviously the same species, but to make them individual and different, to give their personality to the different faces. And I always, when I'm designing these things, like to put in different textures. So we've got the basic rubber head, but if you notice, there's some fur in there, but there's also feathers and various things, other textures, and that helps to give it a lot of life.
Yeah, that's right. Where's the referee? No, you got to take your head off. Stop her, somebody stop her. Come back, little lady. Play the game. Yeah, we're going to throw your head. Come on. You can't quit.
But now, because of being in this world, that what we think is fun turns not quite so much fun. They become rather threatening.
Grab it. Hey, don't you want to look like us? Take off your head. I want her. Get us off. Well, if you please, take off your head.
It was a very physical film. There was a lot of running around, a lot of climbing, falling down holes, because we kept moving, although we're in the same world, which is bounded by the idea of a labyrinth. We've got lots of different aspects of it. We're about to... quite a shot, this. We're into the bog of eternal stench, which is very juvenile, I think. I'm not sure I approve of this part of the story, but we had, for this film, a royal premiere. And I was at the opening of the Museum of Moving Image, which was opened by Prince Charles. And I met him, and I'd mentioned to him that we'd met before, and he said, "Oh, really, where was that?" And I said, "The premiere of Labyrinth." And he said, "Oh, the Bog of Eternal Stench. I loved it. It was very funny." He said, "I was laughing." He said, "I was, in fact, the only one laughing." And he was. I think at the royal premiere, nobody dared think this was funny, but he loved it. So we have royal approval for this scene.
Oh my gosh.
Don't pretend to be so hard. I know you came back to help me, and I know that you're my friend.
Did not, am not. I just come to get me property back. Yo, and
This everything, of course, is made of plaster. We see all this stonework. And England is famous for its plasterers. They were always brilliant at what they did. And I have to say, I always, when I look at movies now, look at brickwork or stonework to see how well it's done, because everybody thinks it's easy. You just put up a slab of wet plaster and draw lines in it, but it's more complicated than that. And I think they did a brilliant job in all this.
oh my god.
I don't know why you always think you can smell this. We don't have smelly vision, but it's very evocative.
Ow. Watch it. You step in this stuff and you'll stink forever. Stop!
So here we are with Sir Didymus. So he came from just me making a painting and of a character. I just thought, well, what if there was something like this? And he's very typical of what I like to do, because you're not quite sure what he is. You know, is he a fox? Is he a dog? And he is indeed those things, and yet he can talk, and yet he has legs, and he's dressed in a Elizabethan costume, and he has and I put armor on him, and it just somehow this character emerged, and you know, the writers really enjoyed bringing him to life. And he's also like very exuberant. So puppeteer just had great time doing him, and he giving him a staff is quite a useful thing, because not only does he give him a so-called weapon that has a function, it also is really good for puppeteering the hands, because traditionally Muppets are hand puppets with arm wires. And in a lot of the puppets I design, I have to find ways of hiding the arm wires or hiding those things. And just to give him a stick is really a useful thing. And this is great because it shows scale. And in my paintings and drawings, I always like to juxtapose big things and little things. And here we got it par excellence. That there's big characters and little characters, but they're both equal in the strength of their character.
Sir Ludo, if that's thy name, now I, Sir Didymus, yield to thee. Come, let us be brothers.
The patch on his eye gives him a bit of a rakish quality. But as it implies, he's had a bit of a past. When he's been in the wars, he's been up to various things. And he has, but he's probably in retirement now. And he's living at this bridge, which he's determined to defend at all costs. So he's another one of the barriers that we have to get through on this story.
Blood. No one shall pass this way. without my permission.
Well, may we have your permission?
Well, yes?
There, see, it's just simple, really, wasn't it? Often, especially in all good fairy tales, if you ask the right question, you get the right answer.
Yeah, sweet lady, this bridge has lasted for 1,000 years.
So we use a lot of physical things in this movie to suggest things. Bridges to cross and doors to go through, but things to go wrong, of course. So Jennifer was up there for a while, but there was a stunt girl doing the more dangerous bit. Because although, it was fake bog of stench, and that water was there for quite a while, and it didn't get very pleasant. Now, this is very Jim, this idea of creatures that are commune with nature. I mean, he really believed in connection with the world, and so he really wanted Ludo to be connected to the rocks, and the fact that he can summon them up and talk to them, and the rocks are his friend. I think it's really quite a beautiful and strong view.
My brother, canst thou summon up the very rocks?
Sure, Rock's friends.
Hoggle!
Here.
Thanks, Hoggle. Careful, Ludo!
This is another Muppet moment, if you ask me. I've always loved the one where Hammer is hitting little fluffy creatures and they're making noises, and I think this is an extension of that.
Attaboy, my loyal steed.
And so here we see the dog again, and you can see why we chose this, because it was a wonderful dog. But we could replace it now and then when we needed to with a puppet. This is great. I love this bit because the dog zipped past. I think that was really impromptu. They weren't expecting him to go so fast.
I wouldn't do that.
So here's the peach, which is very symbolic, really, because it's rather like the apple that Eve is tempting with, but it's also very sensual. Being a peach, it's about her entering into another phase of her life, a sensual phase. It's a moment of her to, when she eats it, in a sense, to grow up, to have knowledge of other things.
She'll soon forget all about you, my fine fellow. Just as soon as Hoggle gives her my present, then she'll forget everything.
Is that my stomach or yours, Ambrosius?
Noises are really quite important in this. We always find noises and music enhance everything, help to give life to it. Because I say that often puppets don't do very much, and you need to imply they can do everything. So if you can get them to do one thing really well, that's really useful. But of course, especially with Hoggle, we were moving on with some very sophisticated technology going into the face with servos and radio control. And we were pioneering on this. And it's very interesting to realize how long ago this was and how well this stands up. I think it does so because it has an immediacy to it. What you're seeing is actually happened in a studio. There aren't a huge amount of tricks. There's no other layer going on the top. It's a performance. So that immediacy really comes across on it, which people really respond to. And this was Michael Motion, who manipulated these crystal balls that we saw perform, and we said, wouldn't it be, or Jim would say, wouldn't it be neat if David Bowie could do that? So Michael was behind David in the costume, doing that, hidden. So here we have the bubble sent out, was moved from being a crystal ball now into a bubble that's very childlike and magical, but yet there are things in it. So they're sort of trapped in there, and there's a sinister aspect to it, because she's about to be trapped into this bubble.
Yea, verily! Whoa, Ambrosius, whoa! The castle doth lie yonder, my lady. My lady?
Dog puppet there.
My lady.
Off she is going now, and trapped into the bubble, off into the beginning, I guess, of her growing up. I've always loved Venice and Venetian masks, and so is Jim. Jim loved masks as well. So he jumped at the chance of letting me do this, and I said, well, this is about when she's trying to be in a grown-up world. And I said, the thing about aristocracy was often this idea of dressing up, and these are people dressing up as goblins, and they're wearing goblin masks. So there's a sinister aspect to it, and yet there's decorative. It's hiding lots of things. You're never quite sure whether the people are good or bad. We don't know, and it's a moment of this dramatic. And yet, it's about her entering into a grown-up world, and it's not always that pleasant. Now, we had a few people originally in this scene. Jim said there was only like about 20, and I designed lots of costumes for the men and the women, especially the women's dresses, which are very flamboyant and flowing and sort of falling off, and there are bits of armor in there as well, reflecting the goblin world. And when the set was built and he put the people in, Jim said, I need a lot more people, and he like a huge amount more people. And in a few days, I had to costume a lot more. And I went and hired a lot of costumes, and I mixed up sort of medieval shirts, things from Henry VIII's time. There were things from other movies, and I mixed and matched them and added bits so it all blends in. You wouldn't know that I hadn't really designed it. And we had to make a lot of new masks as well. Now, Jim wanted me to be dancing in this, and I said, "You crazy? Well, not only can't I dance, but I haven't got the time, because this took 10 days of filming, and I couldn't afford the time. I was always, as I say, on the next set, getting it ready. I didn't have time to do that." Jennifer's hair, I think, is very interesting in this, because Jim wanted ringlets, and I was horrified at this, and Jennifer's parents really weren't that sure about it. They didn't want her to grow up too much in this scene. And so I had a meeting with them and the hairdresser, and to try and figure out what to do with her hair. And within I knew I had that meeting that evening, and that afternoon I put together these silver leaves and all the entwining bits. I knew I wanted something Art Nouveau, something that was connected to nature and yet had a sophistication to it. So I made all these bits, and we went to the meeting, and we sort of piled all sorts of things on her hair, and it was very complicated, and gradually we simplified it and got to that, as you see on the screen. And I'm really happy with that. I love it. And this is very dreamlike, very studio-like, which I like about this movie. There was no attempt to make it real. And this is great to be in the junk heap. It's like all the bits and pieces left over from other stories. bits and pieces left over from fragments of dreams. There's sort of references to all sorts of things. And what we're about to see is, I think, is a great character. I looked at ways of inventing characters and looked at traditional ways of puppeteering, and this was just a way, a theatrical way, I suppose, of creating something, of hiding the puppeteer. So this is a puppeteer that stands up, and the head is puppeteered by the hand, and the puppeteer's body is in whatever's on the back. And so I invented this sort of pile of junk to hide it. You know, it could have been like a pile of sticks, it could have been anything, but it was junk. And again, once the writers saw this, it suggested possibilities of story. And it comes like at the right moment here, because she's, what, 3/4 of the way through, and getting closer to maybe finishing her adventure. But she's, you know, this is a dangerous moment because she might give up, and indeed this is the moment where the character, which is the labyrinth itself, conspires to make her give up. So our little bag lady, I suppose she is, our junk lady, perfectly expresses that. So we think maybe she's home. It's all over. But you know, is this a dream? Is it illusion? And I think that's one of the questions you always have to ask yourself about the whole movie. Did she dream it? I mean, I think it's, we play with that idea, but I mean, there is a real adventure, there's real danger, and yet it's all reflections of our own psychology. I love this scene. It starts off in a very simple way, and yet becomes quite psychologically complex. And she keeps being given all the comforting things that she remembers, things that would be safe for her, which are really part of her past, part of her childhood. But we discover they're not safe. Things are being piled up on her, that it traps her. We have glimpses in here of her room, and we see the little figures, the things that there's the figure of the Goblin King. Now we know that he is part of her imagination. We see the books, we see the posters, we see the various things that turn up for real in the adventure.
Nonsense. It's all here. Everything in the world you've ever cared about is all right here. Look, here's your little...
That little nagging voice keeps saying, "Why don't you have this, dear? Just this little thing." A little grumpy face. I love it.
Beyond the Goblin City, take back the child that you...
Traditionally in fairy tales, there are rhymes and riddles. Rhymes are very important, and here's an important one as she discovers she's about to be trapped. My wife Wendy made that little figure in the musical box.
I have to save Toby!
So she remembered what her task is.
My lady! Are you all right? My lady! Fair maiden, thank goodness thou art safe at last.
Where are we?
Sarah back.
My lady, look, we're almost there. Those are the gates to the Goblin City.
So here we are at the beginning of the end of our journey. We're at the gates of the Goblin City. So this is the center of the labyrinth, the heart of the labyrinth, of course. Who sits there is the Goblin King. I did lots of drawings for goblins, and we had a great time making all the goblins, and all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And a lot of them, of course, are small, but it was great to be able to do a tall, thin one. But of course, they're problematical to make stand or manipulate them. So to have one leaning against a wall makes life so much easier. So he's asleep, but we can puppeteer through the stonework.
And my sense of smell is keen. Oh, yes. Then I shall fight anyone, anywhere, any place, any time.
No.
It was just a simple resolve there to get through the door.
Be quiet now. I don't see why we have to be so quiet. It's only a goblin city.
I smell trouble.
And this is very fairy tale and storybook in its look. Now, Jim at this said, I want a humongous figure, because he felt it's very important to have some big creature at this point, and I really resisted it. And I said, no, do we have to? And he said, yes, I really want something big. And I thought, well, the only way I'll do it is if I could find a really interesting way of bringing it into the story. And so I had this idea of it being the design on doors, which is a theme that's gone through the whole of the film, doors and patterns on it. And once the doors joined together, this creature could step out, then I was on board. And Jim loved it. And of course, then we had to build it. And this is a huge mechanical thing. This is probably one of the biggest puppets ever made. And I also wanted to have some other secret to it. I just didn't want it to be a straightforward monster. So I thought, well, what if it was really mechanical and it was sort of a robot? And we discover that in the head there is a little goblin. I suppose it's a bit Wizard of Oz, really. It was a huge metal machine underneath, but the top was clad in rubber, so nice bit of ironwork, painting going on there. And he's, I love this little guy, which I like creatures that refer to other things, so he's part goblin, part little flying man, he's little goggles and wings.
Come here, and what? Oh, there's reverse.
Though this was quite dangerous. This thing going through the air, you had to really be quite clear of this because it could cause a problem. And here's where Hoggle is beginning to redeem himself. And this is interesting because not only is Sarah on her journey and developing her character, and so are the other characters. Hoggle is softening, is getting more responsibility. This is really important to the story, but also I think with like Jim's philosophy, he liked the idea that we were all connected and that we all need to take responsibility not only for ourselves but for each other. And he enjoyed friendship, the importance of friendships. And these characters forge a great friendship together throughout this movie.
Let's get that rat who calls himself Sheriff.
Right.
Yeah.
Come on.
Ambrosius, it's safe now. Nothing to be afraid of.
So the Goblin City is very storybook. Is like an illustration out of, which I think is like Grimm's fairy tales. We refer a lot to other stories in this. It was important to remember that it was part of the various books that she's read. It wasn't meant to be just novel and different. It was meant to refer to lots of things and to be sort of familiar, I suppose.
What? They've got through the gates and they're on their way to the castle!
Stop her!
we had to armor a lot of goblins. And so there's certain bits of armor that are specially designed, that molds were made of, and then they were cast. There were certain designs that were, oh, there's another bit of the beginning of that film of a certain theme. I don't know what that was about. But go back to the armor, was that we made a lot of it that could be cut and joined together to create different shapes. Now these were, which we saw a glimpse of it very early on, is that technique of hiding a performer within the body of a creature. So it looks like there are two characters, one riding the other, but the puppeteer's head is in the head of the riding character, and he's puppeteering the head of the ridden character. And so again, we wanted like a whole group of them, but I wanted to make them individual, so I color-coded them. And one of the secrets of this, there's a series of children's books in England called Thomas the Tank Engine, in which all the engines were different colors. And so the armor is painted this colors, but if you look closely at the armor, it refers a lot to steam engines. There's rust, and there's rivets, and there are bits of numbers written on it that's like little steam engines.
Ambrosius, if you don't turn around this second, I will never feed you again.
Great dog. Now, what Jim's used to like to do was to make life difficult. One of the things he did was said, "I want chickens." Now, of course, we had a chicken wrangler who promised these chickens could act, but of course, being chickens, they do nothing. So they run amok. They never are on cue. Very interesting to do a film that's so physical, using puppets. It's again doesn't make life easy, but it was a challenge.
You coward!
We had a lot of puppets, a lot of small people in costumes, a huge amount. I think we've used most of the little people in England in this scene, because we try to use every technique in the film. So there are some little things that are hand puppets, some which are larger. It was a challenge to build so much in quite a short time. And we had a great crew who really got into it, especially in the aging, and because the things look very realistic. Of course, they look like metal, but we couldn't use metal. Of course, it needed to be light because it had to be worn. They had to be light for puppets, so it's all made of what was called mannequin rubber. So it's very lightweight. It also didn't do any damage to any performers or puppeteers.
Enough, have you? All right then.
It's the old puppeteering through the door trick there. So this is when the Ludo can use his trick of summoning up the rocks. So nature, in a sense, comes to rescue her. An interesting combination of just rocks being rolled and mechanical rocks. I mean, little machine things that rolled along. This is where all mayhem comes. This is a very Muppet moment we're about to see. And though we were often violent in this, there was no real violence in it. We were very careful about that. It was all meant to be fun. I mean, there was psychological dangers for Sarah, but the goblins were meant to be really incompetent. Really near the end, Jim said, I really wanted some big machine, and we hadn't made anything. And within like 2 days, we built this goblin machine, which is great credit to the team, was that we were well oiled in our creativity, and we just built it. I was once going to a convention. I was at the Heathrow airport sitting in the bar, and I saw the barman looking very puzzled. He was looking around up and down, and then he suddenly looked over the bar, and I followed his eyes, and down there was Kenny Baker. And Kenny Baker, who was one of the tiniest men, was in our that machine. And I saw him get a drink, and he came over and sat near me, and I said hello to him, and I said, I don't know if you remember me, but you were in my movie. And he said, oh, which one was that? And I said, Labyrinth. And he said, oh, you didn't set fire to me, did you? And I said, well, not personally. So apparently, as that machine gun was going off, they suddenly noticed that his whole costume was on fire, and they had to put him out. But he survived.
No. That's the only way he could have gone.
Well then, come on.
No. I have to face him alone.
But why?
Yes.
Because that's the way it's done.
Well, if that is the way it is done, then that is the way you must do it. But should you need us...
Yes. Should you need us?
I'll call. Thank you.
Very typical of fairy tales is that you gather your people as you go. You've learnt your lessons, but it always has to end up with you doing the right thing at the right time. So this is Sarah. Now, Jim really wanted this Escher thing, and he was so right, because in creating a dream world, there's a tendency for things to be wishy-washy, dreamlike, and often dreams are really quite solid and surreal. And this was using the Escher geometry and the stairs and the false perspectives was a way of making that concrete, and seemingly very dangerous, and it is. I love this moment where the Goblin King walks underneath, and when he comes up over the side, that is very spooky, and that was done for real. That was on a rig, and I think that's just magical. Now, one of the times I actually disagreed with Jim was that he wanted to put Toby up on a tower to be high up, and I'm not that keen on heights, and Wendy is terrified of heights. And I said, no, you can't do that, that's our baby. And he said, oh, it'll be fine, it'll be safe. I said, well, come on, let's show me. And we climbed up top of this tower, and we were 30 feet in the air, and I said, Jim, you can't do this. He said, no, it'll be all right, there'll be a bit of net round it. I said, well, he's going to fall off. He said, no, well, we'll put in some riggers, some men round there, we'll catch him if he falls. I said, no way. I said, what happened to movie magic, Jim? He said, oh, you're right. So Toby was filmed on just a pair of steps on the floor. And him looking around there was like Wendy and some other friends with musical blowers and noisemakers and calling his name, saying Toby, so he would turn round. So he was just only like a couple of feet off the ground, and he loved it. He loved climbing up the steps. He had a great time. So this is the moment which is a great psychological moment. She has to make literally a leap of faith to rescue him. And as she does that, of course, we enter into this transformational world where we discover that the Goblin King maybe doesn't have as much power as we think. And as he turns up, he's really like a ghost of his former self. I try to do in this costume something that refers to the owl. So he's part owl here, part ghost. He's sort of lost his power, he's lost his colour. He's very kabuki, Japanese theatre. That's where we put the bones. We try to make him ethereal-like.
I have reordered time. I have turned the world upside down, and I have done it all for you. I am exhausted from living up to your expectations. Isn't that generous?
Through dangers untold and hardships unnumbered, I have fought my way here to the castle beyond the Goblin City.
See, this is very true in a sense because she's remembering something she's always known. The revelation is that this is always inside her. She's always known the solution. But she's learnt so much on the journey about the friendship, about taking responsibility for a brother, but also taking responsibility for herself.
And you can have everything that you want.
Kingdom is great. Damn. I can never remember that line.
Still trying to tempt her, still trying to get her to come, but she has won already because he has no power. I suppose like the boogeyman, about the monsters in the closet, that they have no power over us. We always think they do, but if we confront them, they're hollow and gone. I think that's quite lyrical, where he disappears and we just see his fabric. And we're back to the creature of the night and her dreams. And it's the bewitching hour. It's midnight, the time that the fairies come and go. And everything is back to normal.
Toby?
Oh, there's my son. So, Toby, as I said, grew up to be very talented. There is a Jareth ball that's held every year in America where they recreate the ballroom scene and dress in costume, and he's been a few times as like guests, in which they love him there. In which they have like a dummy baby dressed in the little stripy costume, which quite disconcertingly throw around. And it's been intriguing to see how much this movie has touched people. It seems to speak to, especially girls, of some of their predicament about when they're growing up. She's putting away some of her childish things now, and is about to be a woman, I suppose.
Goodbye, Sarah.
Now, I suppose I'm not supposed to say this, but I can't say I really like this ending. I wanted to finish it right there and then, but Jim wanted to bring the characters back, and I said, well, I think it's fine that she knows that they are there if they're needed. In fact, they are, because they're all aspects of herself that she can call upon in future life. But I really didn't like the party. I really thought it was unnecessary, and I sort of cringe every time I see it. But I'll be very happy to be proved wrong about this. I think lots of people really liked it, but it's very hard to see, especially like The Wise Man, a lot of out of character there. But, oh well. But it was a great movie to be on, and a great privilege to be working with Jim Henson. He was an extraordinary man who encouraged talent and creativity, and he allowed me to do some extraordinary things here and would help me fulfill my vision and his. And we had a huge group of very talented people working on this, which I think they all really rose to the challenge, because to work for Jim was a privilege, and I would just like to say thanks, Jim.
Rejection, no love injection. Life can't be easy. It's not always swell. Don't tell me truth hurts, little girl, 'cause it hurts like hell. Hurts like hell. But down in the underground, you'll find someone true.